All right then. So first of all, we're going to look at the Stack logo, because the Stack logo actually shows pretty well what Stack does. How many people feel like they're pretty comfortable with what Stack is? Just a handful of people. Awesome. So the Stack logo is a really good representation of what Stack does. You can look at the bottom block as an app, and then each of the little tiny pieces represent functionality or middlewares. And each of these middlewares and the app get a chance to act on a request and then act on the response. So what middlewares do with Stack is give your application added functionality, new behavior, without actually modifying the app itself. Stack provides a functionality for adding these at a different layer than actually inside your application. But before we go too much into that, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about where Stack came from. How many people are in the Silex PHP channel? Does anyone visit there? How many people are on IRC? Awesome. If you like Symfony stuff, and you're all Symfony developers here, I'm guessing, or interested in Symfony, Silex PHP is a really great resource if you want to go check it out. There's a lot of cool people in there doing different things. I started hanging out there about 2 years ago, and right around that time I was working with a project called Tent. Has anyone heard of the Tent protocol? Worked with it at all? It's sort of a distributed diaspora type thing. The first major implementation was more like a Twitter, like a distributed Twitter where everyone had a URL rather than a username, and you could have your own Tent server. I wanted to build a PHP implementation of the Tent protocol. PHP server implementation. The reference implementation was written in Ruby, and I know enough about Ruby to look at it and say, I think this is a Rails app. So I told the Tent developers as I was working through these problems, like, I don't understand what's going on here, I don't know Rails. And they said, yeah, it's not Rails. This is a rack application. It's like, oh, okay, well this is interesting, it's different, I didn't really know what it was about. Started to work with it a lot more, and really discovered that I liked how Rack worked. I think they were kind of abusing it in how they were using it, but in general, I liked the way that Rack sort of was working. It was basically a bunch of middleware stacked together to make an application. So I dropped back into the Silex channel because that's where I was doing most of my work at that point. And I talked to Igor, and I said, hey, what's the closest thing in PHP to middlewares? And his response was, I guess, HTTP kernel decorators. And it's at a certain point, later in that conversation, he said, I guess you can think of it like stacked HTTP kernels. This is kind of interesting for me because I've never really been at the beginning of a project, but this has really stuck out in my mind because this is where Stack was born. And I was there and I remember it. And it's one of those weird situations for me because I can't remember where other projects started, where other ideas came from, but I actually have this in my IRC logs because I thought it was that important. So this was in February of last year. A couple months went by. We worked on it a little bit and resulted in creating stackphp.com, and Igor launched it at SymfonyLive in Portland last year. And his HTTP kernel interface is a live talk. Has anyone seen this talk? Awesome. I see a couple people nodding heads. If you haven't seen this talk, definitely look it up. It goes into a lot of the theory leading up to how Stack was created, and just in general, why this kind of architecture is really useful and how it has roots all the way back to like early days of Unix. But yeah, basically, this is how Stack started. And since then, it's sort of taken off a little bit. Some of the other frameworks are starting to pick it up, like Laravel, Drupal. Obviously, Silex and Symfony 2 full stack can leverage this. But it sort of is still kind of on the edge. People aren't really sure what it's about. So my hope is to share kind of the power of Stack and how you can start leveraging it right now in your current applications. So what is Stack? We have a really nice little blurb on our website that if you don't know what we're saying, it's probably confusing. In the description, the best way to describe Stack is a convention for composing HTTP kernel interface middlewares. So if you don't know what some of these words mean, probably the whole thing just like, yeah, whatever, I don't know what you're talking about. So we're going to walk through some of these words to see what they mean. The first one we're going to talk about is convention. I think probably one of the most confusing aspects of Stack is that people don't realize it's not a library. It's not a library and it's not a framework. Stack is a convention. In fact, it's a set of conventions. A Stack middleware must implement the HTTP kernel interface. It may delegate to a decorated HTTP kernel interface instance. And it must take the HTTP kernel interface delegated object as its first argument in the constructor. And that's it. If you do that, if you create an object or if you create a class that does these things, you've created a Stack middleware. So there's no framework, there's no interfaces, there's no Stack interfaces that you need to deal with. It's simply a convention. So is everyone following to this point? Any questions about conventions? Awesome. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is HTTP kernel interface. Since this is SymfonyLive, I'm guessing most of you know what the HTTP kernel interface is. Is there anyone who does not? Okay, awesome. So just to recap, HTTP kernel interface handles converting a request into a response. This is actually the comment inside the class itself. This can be represented by a nice little diagram. You're basically taking input, doing something, and giving output. Another thing that you'll see on our website is that Stack is framework agnostic, or at least that's the goal. One of the goals of Stack is to help be framework agnostic, which conflicts a little bit with the fact that we're so heavily involved with Symfony, which makes some people say, whatever, you say you're framework agnostic, you're not. You're just another Symfony application. But where the power of this comes in and where it sort of makes a little more sense is when you start considering how many applications and frameworks use HTTP kernel interface, specifically Drupal and Laravel. Those are very big in the community right now. They're all working with HTTP kernel interface. They've moved in that direction. So Stack works with those as well. So while you might immediately think that this will only work with Symfony 2 full stack or maybe potentially Silex, it actually works with several other frameworks as well. The next part of the definition that we're going to talk about is composing. How many people are familiar with composition? Yeah, a couple hands. Okay, that's a pretty good number. When you're talking about composition, from a real high level, you're talking about the difference between a has-a relationship and an is-a relationship. Stack likes the has-a relationship. It's very useful for extending, especially if you're talking about not relying on any other interfaces, not relying on any other code. Has-a is far better than having to extend a base class. And in fact, if you're talking about interfaces, you start talking about another pattern, which is the decorator pattern. How many people are familiar with the decorator pattern? Okay, a lot of people. Awesome. If you don't know what the decorator pattern is, I like to think of it as a wrapsa. Basically, you wrap another instance of the same interface with a new implementation. One of the side effects of the decorator pattern is that your instance must implement every method. And this is seen as a con for the decorator pattern. But since we're talking about the HTTP kernel interface, it only has one method, the handle method. And since it only has one method, it's not really a problem. It's actually really easy to decorate an HTTP kernel interface method because you only have to basically implement one method. So any questions about composition? Okay, awesome. So we're going to talk about middlewares. If I say middlewares, how many people have an idea of what that means? A couple people, okay. How many people know that definition from Wikipedia? Because Wikipedia's definition for middlewares is very different than our definition. Okay, awesome. So middlewares, I feel like they're kind of misunderstood. I think that not everyone understands what they mean. For example, the Silex framework. How many people use Silex regularly? Okay, that's a pretty good number. Silex framework talks about middlewares as adding functionality before or after a route, before or after the application runs, and then when the application is done, as in after the response has been served. It does this by way of callables, and it's really using the event system. So it's a middleware within Silex would be a specific, I want to do something before the request, or I want to do something after. There's no unified concept of this is a middleware that can do both of those things. Other frameworks like Django has the same sort of thing. They have basically extensions into their system that allows them to do plugins and extensibility in their request and response handling. These are probably the first places I've seen middlewares in use where it was actually called a middleware. And then there's Rack. And Rack is probably the closest implementation to what we're doing with Stack. And Rack considers itself implementing the pipeline pattern, where it lets you put things between the client and the server in the request and response stack. So it's probably the closest to what we're doing with Stack. So at this point, we've hopefully covered all of this definition. So once again, Stack is a convention for composing HTTP kernel interface middlewares. Are there any questions to this point? Okay, cool. So now we can dive into what a middleware looks like. The most basic middleware that you can create is a pass-through middleware. As you can see, it implements HTTP kernel interface. It takes another HTTP kernel interface instance as its first constructor arg. And then you'll see inside the handle method, which it's implementing the handle method, it's delegating, basically passing through all of the arguments to the app that had been passed in. So this is the most simple form of a middleware. This is the most basic. This is still pretty wordy. It's pretty bulky. So for the sake of brevity, we're going to, what's the word? We're going to shorten HTTP kernel interface. We're just going to call it HKI. And we're also going to drop the type hinting and the trailing two arguments for the handle method. So what we end up with is this. So the future examples that you'll see, we'll use HKI instead of HTTP kernel interface, and we will just have a simpler looking handle method. So if you see that later, don't think that the code's broken. I'm doing this intentionally. So if we break open the pass-through method, or the pass-through middleware, we can look at where we can do things. So for example, before you do anything, before you delegate, you can inspect and modify the request object. You delegate to the app, and then you have a chance to inspect and alter the response. Or you could create an entirely new response if you like. So these are the different sections of what you can do within the handle method. And again, this comes back to the diagram of the Stack logo. So you can have things that come in on the request. Each individual middleware gets to have a chance to handle the response and then pass to the next thing in the stack. And then on the way back, everything gets the chance to do something with the response. So if you ever get lost with Stack, you can always refer to the Stack logo, and hopefully that helps you better understand, again, exactly what's going on with Stack. So any questions about the basics of a middleware implementation? Okay, awesome. Next thing we're going to talk about is Stack Builder. Builder is a tool that we've provided to help you implement Stack, but it's very important to know that Builder is not required to implement Stack. So it's there as something that you can use, but don't think that you have to use it. As long as you're still following the conventions, it works great. This just makes life a lot easier for you if you want to implement it yourself. And the way that it works also follows the same pattern with the Stack logo. You basically push on middlewares onto a stack, and then you resolve the stack against the main application that you're trying to run. And the end result is a stacked HTTP kernel interface implementation that knows how to basically start off the stack and pass on to the next one as it goes through. The push method accepts the class name of your Stack middleware, and optionally the arguments that need to be passed to the constructor in addition to the previous decorated object, or a callable whose first argument is the HTTP kernel interface. So you could, if you needed to do like a test or something like that, you could actually just write an inline function call that accepts the decorated app as its first argument and do whatever you want to in there. So this can be really good for rapid prototyping of a new Stack middleware that you aren't sure exactly what you need and you don't want to create a class yet. You can go ahead and just basically fake it and do it inline. As I mentioned earlier, Laravel is using Stack. It's actually a first-class citizen in the Laravel framework now. It's using Stack Builder, and it's pushing cookie guard, cookie queue, and its own session middleware onto the stack. This means that every Laravel 4 application currently is running at least 3 Stack middlewares. So this is something that is actually being used by people right now. And it's not super public, really. I don't think people are talking about it too much. But this is in Laravel. Every Laravel request is handling requests using Stack. Similarly, Drupal, as of about 3 weeks ago, has merged in first-class support for Stack into Drupal 8. It should be on master now as of 3 weeks ago. Their implementation is similar to Laravel's in how you can add new middlewares. However, they're actually using Symfony's container and using tagged services. So what it's doing is there's an HTTP kernel factory, which is an instance of Stack Builder. It's looking for all of the tag services for HTTP middleware, doing some magic with them, and then calling push with the middlewares. So how many people are familiar with Symfony's container configuration stuff? Okay, awesome. So this makes sense to you all for the most part? Okay. If you don't know, don't worry. This is Symfony magic. If you're isolated from that, that's awesome. But if you know what's going on here, this is basically Stack Builder. So it's generating code dynamically to do basically the Stack Builder call to push middlewares on dynamically. What this means is that at this point, anyone can add a Stack middleware to Drupal by way of a module. So you install a new module that implements or that provides a Stack middleware. It'll automatically add the Stack middleware to the stack for you. So Drupal people won't even have to worry about configuring Stack in any sort of way. It'll just become a way that they do business. They'll just add a new middleware and it'll just work. Any questions about Stack Builder or Laravel or Drupal 8? Okay, awesome. No questions. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them. I like answering questions if you have them. So we're going to move on and talk about a couple of middlewares. The first middleware we're going to talk about is the inline middleware. The inline middleware is probably one of the first ones that we wrote. Its job is to accept a callable and basically just pass on to the callable when it's handling a request. And it passes the delegated app as the function call. So this is pretty similar to Stack Builder passing a function. This would be if you wanted to do some prototyping, quickly testing out Stack ideas without actually having to commit to creating a new Stack class. A quick implementation of this would be creating a small Silex app. We're going to create a root route that is going to look at an attribute on the request, and if callable middleware is set, it is going to return a response with the text success. If that does not exist, it's going to return a 500 error with the text of the body being failed. Our inline middleware is going to be a really simple little callable that accepts HTTP kernel interface app, which is the decorated application. In this case, our Silex app. The first thing it's going to do is, in the request phase, is set an attribute on the request. So it's going to set the callable middleware to the word success, to a string success. It's then going to delegate to the passed-in app and capture the response. And then on the response, in the response handling side of the Stack phase, it's going to take whatever the response's content was, so the string, and put square brackets around it. And then it's going to return the response. We're going to use Stack Builder, and we're going to push on the Stack inline middleware, and we're going to pass in our inline middleware, and then we're going to resolve the stack against our Silex application. And what we will get from this request, if you do a root request to this application, you're going to get a 200 response with success with the square brackets. So we've, in this simple example, you can see both inspecting a request and modifying the request before passing it on, before delegating it. And you can also see modifying the response as it comes back. So any questions about this inline middleware before we move on? Okay, awesome. This middleware is great for testing, which is one of the reasons we wrote this first. You can do all sorts of things where you can write spies. If you're at Dave's talk on spies and mocks and whatever, you can do testing by having middlewares that will listen at various layers and save state or check state, all sorts of things. So you can use this if you're going to write your own middleware to test it. There's also a session middleware. This is another one that we sort of added right away. This is just going to be a really quick walkthrough of this. This is not the actual implementation. It's just sort of to give you an idea of how it works. The general idea is that when the request comes in, it's going to set the session variable that is associated with the middleware itself. You pass in the session object. And then we're going to set on the session the value within the request cookie. So we're doing this before anything has happened. We're doing this before your application has been called. Next, we're going to delegate to your application and get the response back. And then we're going to check to see if there was a session and the session was started. We want to go into the response and set the appropriate cookie based on the session that we have. So whatever information is changed on the session will be added to every single response that comes out of this middleware. And finally, we pass back the response. So if there is session information, session-related information, it will now be included on every single request. As I mentioned, it's a little more complicated than that. This was just kind of a high-level overview. If you want to see what this would look like in practice, we're going to make another Silex application, and we're going to create a login route. And the login route is going to do some things. It's going to get the session off the request. It is going to get the username and password that the user has supplied. And if that information has been supplied and is what we expect, we're going to set some values on the session, and we're going to redirect to the account page. Otherwise, we're going to redirect, or otherwise we're going to challenge with the authenticate method. On the account route, we're going to look at the session, get the session again. We're going to see if a user has been set, and if it has, or if it has not, we're going to redirect to the login page. So this will set the login if the information's not there. Otherwise, it's going to say hello username. So this is relatively easy stuff to do without Stack and actually directly with Silex, but this shows how you can interact with the session object. All you need to do to activate this is create a stack with the stack builder and push the session stack middleware and resolve it. And the session will already be on the request for you. You don't have to do anything else. So if you're not using Silex, but you're using some other HTTP kernel interface application, or if you're writing your own from scratch, I think OpenCFP, has anyone looked at the OpenCFP source code? Okay, that looks like it's a completely homegrown application based on some of Symfony's components, some of, I think there's some Illuminate components in there. But that would be something here where they wouldn't have to implement session themselves. They could just add the session middleware onto their application, and now all of their application can leverage session without having to find some other way to do that. Any questions about session at this point? Okay. The URL map. URL map is useful for welding different applications onto a URL hierarchy. This is useful if you have an application that basically requires itself to be installed at root. Every once in a while you'll find applications like that where it expects that you aren't going to install it under /blog or under /form. It has to be under /root. Or sometimes it just makes life difficult to do it any other way. So what URL map does is it accepts a map of URL prefixes to applications, which are HTTP kernel interfaces. It looks at the path info and looks to see, processes each of the paths to find out which one, to see if this particular path matches the incoming request. If it does, it starts to extract out the information from the request and creates a new copy with some new information, which is basically rewriting the base URL. It also does this with some attributes, and it keeps the prefix so that if for some reason the application needs to know, well, where was I originally, or where was I mapped originally, you can still inspect that and get that information from your application if you need it. So this is an example of a stack middleware providing additional information about some meta content to the request before it's delegated. Since in theory request object should be immutable, we're going to generate a new version of the request object with the new information. So basically, the new request object is going to think it's located at a new path. And then we're going to have this particular app for this path delegate the response. So at this point, it's going to break the cycle, and it's going to say, I'm done. So this app will run as if it were at root, but actually at another path. If it doesn't find any mapped paths that match the prefix, it will just delegate to the main application. So an example, if we're looking at a simple main application that's a Silex application, we're going to create another one called blog that's going to have a root path itself, and we're going to create a forum application that has a root path as well. And then we're going to create a simple map that says I want /blog to run the blog application, and I want /forum to run the forum application. And create our stack with the stack builder, and push the URL map stack on. And if we make a request to /, it's going to return main application. If we make a request to /blog, it's going to say this is the blog. Now that application itself isn't going to know that its URL was /blog. That application is going to think that its URL was /. So it doesn't know anything at all about the fact that it's inside stack at this point. So this has some use cases where someone might want to move from a Silex application to a Symfony 2 full stack application, like if they want to migrate from one to the other. You could start doing bits and pieces in one app versus the other. The other thing that you can do if you use like a lazy HTTP kernel, you could have this such that your applications don't even load until they know which URL they are at. So for example, if /forum was a really big application, it might not ever get loaded into memory at all unless it's actually at the /forum URL. So there's some different use cases why you might want to do something like this. HTTP cache is another middleware. This is actually the original stack middleware. It didn't know it at the time. It's been around for quite a while, and it fits all of the criteria. It implements HTTP kernel interface. It takes HTTP kernel interface as the first argument, and it delegates to the other delegated app when it needs to. This is a really complicated middleware. Has anyone ever looked at this class at all? It actually does quite a bit, so I'm not going to walk through this because it's not really real, but it sort of gives you an idea of what it's trying to do. Basically, before the request, it checks to see if the cache is valid, moves on, and then afterwards it caches it if it thinks it should. So yeah, that's not even close. It's probably 600 lines worth of code. I couldn't condense it any more than that. GeoIP is another interesting stack middleware that was actually, I think this is one of the first third-party stack middlewares created. It takes a geocoder instance and also optionally a header. Its job is to inspect every request that comes in, find the client IP, and then if the client IP exists, set the header to whatever country is in there, or whichever country represents the IP address, and then delegate it to the application. So if we wanted to create a simple example of this, we can say that we'll create a root route of a Silex application, and we're going to get the IP address from the request, and then we're going to get the country from the header, and then we can return IP address to the country name. So we can add this functionality simply by pushing the GeoIP stack middleware. So while this might have been easier to do or possible to do in other ways, this same little bit of code can basically give you the X country header to any Symfony application without changing the Symfony application in any way. or without changing the Laravel application, or without changing Drupal. So these types of little bits of functionality that add things that can be useful to you can be done at a different layer than actually working in your application. So like we could take this one step further, for example, and say we're going to also use the stack inline middleware. And the stack inline middleware is going to block all but people from the US, because I'm from the US. So what this middleware does now is it's going to take an app. It doesn't know which app it's taking. I think that's important to mention too. You never know what the app is that you're getting. And it's going to get the request, because that's how the inline middleware works. We're going to look to see that the country, if the country is not equal to US, it's going to redirect to Google. Otherwise, it lets the application go through. So we've now done a really rudimentary IP level or country level blocking on an application that was really super simple to begin with, without ever changing the application. So by adding and combining different middlewares, you're able to do some pretty interesting things. Any questions about this before I move on? Okay. We have another relatively trivial middleware called Backstage. This is basically a maintenance page. You know, you're working on your code in production, which you're never supposed to do, and you want a little maintenance page to come up. This is a really, really simple implementation. Basically, you're passed the path to the actual static maintenance page that you want to load. And every request that comes in, it'll check to see if that path exists. If that path exists, it returns a new response with the contents of that file, and it's done. So this is a case where we're not letting the delegated app ever get called. We're just going to return right away before we even get into the point where we're doing anything with the other app. So a quick little example would be, you know, the root request, my app is working. So for the most part, this is how your app is going to work. Instead, we're also going to add the Backstage stack middleware, and we're going to tell it where the maintenance page is. So if I echo down for maintenance out to the location of the maintenance page, do whatever you need to do. At this point, that stack middleware is going to trigger, and every single request from that point before it goes into the rest of your application is going to display down for maintenance. When you're done, simply remove the actual HTML file from the disk, and everything is good to go. Again, this is a really trivial example, and this is still something that you could do in your application in other ways, but this is a way to write this kind of code in such a way that you can use it anywhere. You can use it on Silex, you can use it on Laravel, the whole list of things that I keep talking about. It's really simple code that works at the HTTP level rather than working at the framework level, which is why we like to say it's framework agnostic, even though it's tied to Symfony HTTP kernel interface. There's a lot of other middlewares. These were just the easy ones to talk about that were, you know, I can show you pretty simply how they work. This is just a quick example. Again, the HTTP cache, Cookie Guard was one of the big Laravel ones. That was the thing that actually got Laravel into Stack. Was Igor was following along with some things, and he's like, why are you writing this in Laravel? You're using HTTP kernel interface. This could easily be a middleware. So Taylor Otwell made it into a middleware. And so now we have that shared code, which is great because now anyone can use encrypted cookies that Laravel uses, but you can use them in your Silex application, you can use them in your full stack application, you can use them in Drupal. GeoIP is another IP restrict. Of course, some of these things are a little sketchy. You can't reliably rely on the client IP. I think that can be spoofed. So don't try to use these in production if you don't fully understand them. Backstage is an OAuth middleware. I wrote the basic authentication and Hawk middlewares that do authentication for your requests so that you can skip writing that kind of code. There's a robots one and negotiation. There's a PSR3 logger. I think it's PSR3 logger implementation that will log HTTP requests to whatever PSR3 logger you like to use. There's others as well. So this is a quick list. The future of Stack, I don't think that it's going to last very long. At least that would be my hope. My ultimate hope for Stack is to show people how working at HTTP level for writing code as opposed to writing bundles or writing service providers or writing modules. If you can start adding code in such a way that it works at the HTTP level, it becomes more useful for everybody. You want to write a cache thing, you want to write, and any of these little silly things that people have written so far, they aren't super hard to write in other ways, but now they're written in ways that anyone can use. So that's my goal with Stack, is that this will serve as a reference implementation for people to look at least within the Symfony community and the broader Symfony community, and see a different way to write code. Does anyone know about PHP Fig? Is that a couple of people? Awesome. There's a PSR out that's been out for a while, which is kind of a joke because it's been around for so long. It's the HTTP PSR, PSR 7. Its goal is to standardize the request and response formats. And if something like that were to take off, and we got buy-in from the Symfony community, and we got buy-in from like Aura and Zen Framework 2, and everyone started to talk within the same HTTP messages, basically the request and response, we would be able to write code once for every framework, which is the long-term goal that I see for Stack, is to cease to exist once everyone is writing code that's just PHP. And there's no one writing Stack middlewares even anymore, they're writing PHP middlewares. So that's kind of the long-term goal that I see for Stack. But it's going to be a long time before we get there, but hopefully enough people get excited about it and start talking about it that, if the Symfony community can do it and the Symfony community can serve as a good reference for this, then I think more people will get behind it. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Because I think we're almost done. Awesome. Okay. So as a quick recap, Stack is not a library. Stack is not a framework. Stack is a convention. It's a convention for composing HTTP kernel interface middlewares. And it's currently able to be used by a wide variety of frameworks, what you might call frameworks or application frameworks, including Symfony full stack, but it extends to many more places. If you've been to it's either the Sensio or the Symfony page that talks about who's using the components, if you go to the HTTP kernel interface, or the HTTP kernel project, you'll see there's way more than this listed. I don't know how many of them actually work with Stack, because sometimes they work with little weird edge case things, but there's a lot of people using it. So Symfony's definitely has something special with how simple HTTP kernel interface is and how powerful the request and response objects are. So my goal is to get more people interested in Stack so that we can eventually start writing PHP middlewares as opposed to Symfony kernel middlewares. And I think that's it. I'd love for people to rate the talk on Joined In. It's up here. Leave me good feedback, bad feedback, any feedback as long as it's constructive. I'd like to know what works and what doesn't. So if you can do that, great. You can follow me. I'm Beau Simensen on Twitter. You can also visit my business site, bflydev.com, and the slides for this presentation are at this URL below, and it's also at the Joined In link, so you can get there either way. So any other questions? Yes, question? I think they have the mic.
Hi. Yeah, I just wondered what the main advantage of doing it with something like Stack rather than just having event listeners and event dispatchers before and after the HTTP kernel interface had been run.
So the question is if the event listeners are a better way, or what the advantages are. Really, it's just another approach to it. If you do it with event listeners, then you're buying into whatever the event system is. So for example, like if you're using Silex, you would have to be using Symfony's events dispatcher. Laravel doesn't use Symfony's event dispatcher, or I don't think it does. I don't know if Drupal does either. But if you tie into the event dispatcher, then you're aware of the application at a certain point. To a certain degree, stack middlewares don't have to even be called after your app is bootstrapped. So you can do a lot of things before your code even runs or before it even knows it should run your code. However, if you're doing things within the event listeners, you're already, in theory, you should already have your app bootstrapped and it should know about everything, including the fact that there are event listeners. So it is just another way to accomplish the same thing at a different layer. So sometimes that might be the best solution, but in a lot of cases, you can do something this way instead. Does that answer the question? Okay, excellent.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, from the examples that you gave, I have the impression that some of those could be achieved with an Apache configuration or an Nginx configuration.
Yes, yes.
And by putting them in the application, in the PHP, you're coupling kind of server configuration to the application.
Yes. So the question is whether or not it makes sense to do some of these things in PHP as opposed to the server configuration.
Yeah, because when you deploy your application, you might want to deploy in different contexts, and you want, maybe you don't want to change your application, you just want to change the server configuration for each deployment.
Right. Yep. So to answer that question is yes, that is true. That some of these things probably shouldn't be middlewares and shouldn't be handled at this layer. For example, the URL rewriting thing could more easily be handled by any of the different web servers. The advantage of doing it this way, at least giving you the option, is if you're in some sort of environment where you don't have control over that. Like if you have to deploy in a shared hosting environment or something weird like that, where you can't go and configure the server in any way, you would be able to do that. That should be like a last-ditch effort to do it this way. And again, I consider most of the stack middlewares almost to be toys at this point, because they are easier things like that could be done in other ways. Most of it is to show what could be done, give you the idea that you can have a lot of power in what you're doing with inspecting the requests and the response and manipulating them before passing them on to something else. So yes, I probably should have put that disclaimer out there that a lot of these middlewares are probably things you shouldn't have in production, but they are ways that you can look at it to see how it works, and maybe there are certain things that you can do in PHP that make more sense, like if you need to talk to a database real time before you block an IP, or if you want to do something more sophisticated with like a honeypot detection, where maybe you could pass it off to some other third party, but maybe you want to maintain yourself a list of routes that people are trying to come to and do different things depending on who's making the request, in what order, that sort of thing, where you wouldn't be able to do that as easily as a PHP developer if there's some other tool that is written in some other language. So some of them are edge cases as to whether or not you'd want to use them. And definitely, if you have a better way to do it, don't do it this way just because you want to use stack. I guess that would be my answer, that in certain cases, it does make sense to do it in other ways.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. Thank you for the question. And thank you too. Any other questions? Okay, I guess that's it then.